The city of Kiev, capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, was a place of structured contradictions in the autumn of 1973. It was a city of ancient golden domes and sprawling prefabricated concrete micro-rayons, micro-districts, pushing ever outward. It was a city that had endured unimaginable hardship within living memory, yet now projected an image of robust Soviet modernity. The era of stagnation, or zastoy as it would later be known, had settled in like a persistent, low-grade fever. The Brezhnev Doctrine was absolute, the Prague Spring of 1968 a brutal but fading memory, and the unspoken social contract was clear. The state provided modest stability, and in return, the citizen provided absolute ideological conformity, or at least the convincing performance of it. In a standardized apartment block on the left bank of the Dnieper lived the Petrushenko family. Their flat on the fourth floor was a typical two-room affair, earned through years of patient waiting and loyal service. It was furnished with the obligatory polished wall unit, Stenka, that held books, crystal glasses reserved for holidays, and a small black and white record television. The air carried the faint, omnipresent smell of boiled cabbage and weak cleaning solution. Pavel Ivanovich Petrushenko, 52, was the patriarch. He was an aeronautical engineer at the Antonov Design Bureau, a position of considerable prestige. Pavel was a man of the system, but not necessarily a man of the ideology. He believed in physics, in stress tolerances, and in the tangible achievement of Soviet aviation. He had worked on the An-22, the world's largest turboprop, and felt a deep, genuine pride when he saw it fly. He was a pragmatist, old enough to remember the post-war difficulties and the lean years before the thaw. He valued order, predictability, and above all, discretion. He saw the system not as good or evil, but as a permanent weather condition. One did not challenge the storm, one built a sturdy shelter. His wife, Nina Dmitrievna, 49, was a librarian at the district library. She was quieter than Pavel, with an observational intelligence that missed little. Where Pavel saw blueprints, Nina saw narratives. She curated the shelves, ensuring the approved works of socialist realism were prominently displayed, while quietly guiding trusted patrons to the classics. She understood the power of unspoken words, the narratives that existed in the gaps between the official lines of Pravda. Her anxieties were private, focused mostly on her son. Viktor Pavlovich Petrushenko, 24, was the family's single point of internal friction. He was a final-year history student at Kiev State University. Viktor was a product of the post-Stalin generation. He had not known the depths of the terror, only the suffocating boredom of the zastoy. He was bright, idealistic, and increasingly cynical. He dutifully attended his Komsomol, Young Communist League meetings, mouthing the required slogans. But in private, he and his small circle of friends hunted for different information. They listened to the crackling, jammed frequencies of the BBC World Service and Voice of America, and passed around blurry, typewritten samizdat copies of forbidden literature. He was restless, possessed by the dangerous belief that the truth mattered more than the consequences. The Petrushenko family was, by all appearances, a model Soviet unit, employed, educated, and outwardly compliant. They were a single stable cell in the vast organism of the Soviet state. But within the thin concrete walls of their apartment, the pressure of these three conflicting worldviews, pragmatism, observation, and idealism, was beginning to build. The ideological climate at Kiev State University in 1973 was rigid. The brief thaw of the 1960s was a distant memory, frozen solid by the tanks in Prague. The curriculum was a monument to historical determinism, culminating in the inevitable and correct leadership of the Communist Party. Viktor found this intellectual confinement maddening. The first tremor occurred during a seminar on the history of the USSR, 1930-1940. The lecturer, a dry academic named Professor Borisenko, was discussing the successes of collectivization. He spoke of industrial output, tractor quotas, and the triumph of the socialist agricultural model. When he briefly mentioned temporary food supply difficulties in the early 1930s, Viktor raised his hand. "Comrade Professor," Viktor began, his voice respectful but tense. "Regarding the supply difficulties of 1932 and 33, could you elaborate on the demographic impact in the Ukrainian SSR? Some sources suggest the difficulties were Catastrophic. The room went silent. The other students stared fixedly at their notebooks. Catastrophic was not a word used in this context. The official term was difficulties. Borisenko adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. Comrade Petrushenko, some sources, as you put it, often originate from Western propaganda centers designed to slander the Soviet achievement. The party has been clear on this matter. There were excesses by local officials, certainly, but the period was one of profound transformation, not catastrophe. I suggest you focus on the assigned texts. Victor pushed, a recklessness taking hold. But the assigned texts do not seem to account for the silence, the missing population figures. That is enough, Borisenko said, his voice dropping to a cold, final tone. We are not here to debate bourgeois falsifications. The matter did not end there. 2 days later, Victor was summoned by the Komsomol secretary for his faculty, a humorless older student named Taras. The meeting was not in an office, but in a noisy hallway, designed to feel informal and unimportant. Viktor Pavlovich, Taras said, smiling a thin collegiate smile. Professor Borisenko was concerned about you. He feels your focus is misplaced. You are asking questions that have already been answered. It shows ideological confusion. I was just asking for clarification. Victor defended himself, feeling a cold knot in his stomach. Clarity is found in the party's guidance, Taras replied smoothly. Not in rumors. You are a good student. Your father is a respected engineer. It would be a shame to misunderstand the correct path so close to graduation. Do you understand me? Focus on your thesis. Victor understood perfectly. He was being warned. When he relayed the incident to his parents that evening, the generational divide cracked open. Pavel, his face pale with anger, slammed his hand on the kitchen table. Fool, are you a fool? You study history, but you learn nothing. You do not ask such questions. You do not ask any questions. You write what they tell you to write. You have a good life, a future. Why would you jeopardize this? For what? For the truth? Pavel, lower your voice, Nina pleaded, glancing instinctively toward the wall she shared with their neighbors, the Shapovalovs. It was just a question, Victor muttered, defensive. There is no such thing as just a question, Pavel hissed. There are safe words and there are dangerous words. You used dangerous words. In public. You think they do not write this down? You think this does not go in your file? Everything goes in your file, Victor. Everything. Nina watched her son. Later that night, while tidying his room, she found what she was looking for, tucked beneath his mattress. It was not a single book, but a sheaf of papers bound with string. The type was faint, the 5th or 6th carbon copy, almost translucent. She recognized the title immediately, The Gulag Archipelago. Her hands trembled. She put the papers back, saying nothing. The early sign was no longer a tremor. It was the rumble of an avalanche, and her son was standing directly in its path. The evening that sealed the Petrushenko family's fate began, as many evenings did, with a visit. It was a frigid night in late November, the wind carrying a damp chill from the Dnieper. Victor's university friend, Dmitry Volkov, had come over, ostensibly to study for their upcoming exams on scientific atheism. Dmitry was a contrast to Victor. He was pragmatic, ambitious, and impeccably aligned with the Komsomol. He spoke in the correct, optimistic phrases and seemed destined for a comfortable position within the party apparatus. Victor believed, perhaps naively, that beneath this polished exterior, Dmitry shared some of his frustrations. They had a cautious friendship, built on the shared cynicism of their generation, but Victor did most of the talking, and Dmitry did most of the listening. Pavel and Nina were in the main room, watching the state television program, Vremya, Time. The broadcaster was detailing the latest agricultural quotas, his voice a resonant monotone. Pavel was half asleep in his armchair. In Victor's small room, the two students sat at his desk. The textbook lay open, but they were not discussing it. Victor, feeling confined and agitated, had retrieved a small bottle of Pertsovka, pepper vodka, from his wardrobe. To scientific atheism, Victor said, pouring 2 small glasses. Dmitry raised his glass but hesitated. Your parents, they are watching the tractor reports. They won't hear. They drank. The vodka was harsh, and it loosened Victor's already frayed discretion. He got up and walked to his small radio, a portable VEF-206. He turned the dial, past the loud, clear broadcasts from Moscow and Kiev, into the buzzing, whistling static of the shortwave bands. He was hunting for the jammed signals. "What are you doing?" Dmitry asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "That's illegal." "It's only discouraged," Victor scoffed. "Besides, the jamming is weak tonight." Suddenly, through the wall of electronic noise, a voice emerged, speaking Russian with a distinct British accent. It was the BBC. The broadcast was discussing the 5th anniversary of the Prague Spring. "Turn it off, Victor," Dmitry said, standing up. "I have to go." "Wait, listen," Victor insisted, his eyes bright with the vodka and a reckless fervor. He turned the volume down so the voice was just a faint murmur beneath the static. The report spoke of Alexander Dubček, of socialism with a human face, and of the fraternal assistance that crushed it. "Fraternal assistance," Victor spat, turning the radio off. The sudden silence in the room was heavy. "That's what they call it. Fraternal assistance. They teach us in university that we saved Czechoslovakia from a counter-revolution. But we saved them from themselves. We saved them from an idea." "Victor, this is pointless," Dmitry said, moving toward the door. "Is it? Is it pointless?" Victor blocked his path. He was agitated, emboldened by Dmitry's apparent discomfort. "You read the papers I showed you. You know what Solzhenitsyn writes. You know it's all built on lies. This whole system. My father, he works on their glorious airplanes, but he's terrified. He's terrified of a question asked in a classroom." From the other room, Pavel called out, "Victor, is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Papa," Victor called back, his voice too loud. He turned back to Dmitry, lowering his voice to an intense whisper. "He's afraid. Nina is afraid. Everyone is. We live in a country where this conversation, is a crime. We're told it was a liberation, but the Czechs didn't ask to be liberated. We're told the harvest is a success, but we buy grain from America. We're told we have the freest society, but we have to listen to the truth through this." He slapped the radio. "While the KGB builds electronic walls to keep it out." Dmitry Volkov stood perfectly still. His face was pale. He looked not at Victor, but past him, at the door, as if calculating an escape route. "I am not anti-Soviet," Victor continued, pacing the small room. "I am Soviet. I just want it to be true. What they say. But it's not. The difficulties of the 30s, the assistance in 68, the ideological friendship we force on everyone. It's a house of cards, Dmitry, and we are all just pretending it's a fortress." "You are drunk, Victor," Dmitry said. His voice was flat, devoid of friendship. "And you are a fool. You don't just talk for yourself. You talk for your family. You talk for your friends. You should be careful." "Or what?" Victor challenged. Dmitry didn't answer. He pushed past Victor, grabbed his coat, and walked into the main room. "Leaving so soon, Dmitry?" Nina asked, surprised. "Yes, Nina Dmitrievna. Thank you for the hospitality. We have finished our studies." Pavel grunted a goodbye from his chair. The apartment door clicked shut. Victor remained in his room, his heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and fear. He had finally said it. He had spoken the complete, unvarnished truth as he saw it. He felt a strange sense of relief, of release. In the main room, Pavel looked at Nina. What was that about? The boy looked spooked. Nina stared at the closed door of Victor's room. "I don't know, Pavel, but I think Victor said something he shouldn't have. The discovery was not a document. It was not a hidden weapon. It was a 15-minute conversation, born of vodka and idealism, delivered to the one person who could ensure it would not remain private. The mechanism had been activated. In the Soviet Union, the state did not always act with the speed of a striking cobra. Often, it moved with the slow, crushing, and invisible pressure of a glacier. The 2 weeks following Dmitry Volkov's visit were a masterclass in this passive, suffocating tension. Dmitry, for his part, had reported the conversation. He did not do so out of malice necessarily, but out of a calculated sense of self-preservation. He was an ambitious Komsomol member, and he may have already been a Stukach, informant, for the university's first department, the KGB's Personnel and Security Office. Or perhaps he was pressured, called in by his own Komsomol handler who had heard rumors, and Dmitry offered up Viktor's conversation as a sacrifice to save himself. The why was irrelevant. The what was that a formal donos, denunciation, was filed, passed from the University Komsomol to the local KGB 5th Directorate, the department tasked with ideological subversion. The Petrushenko family did not know this. They only knew that the texture of their lives had changed. The first change was the telephone. It began to click. It was a tiny metallic sound, an echo on the line that hadn't been there before. Nina would be talking to her sister in Zhytomyr, and suddenly there would be a faint pop and a fractional drop in volume. "Are you still there?" she would ask. "Yes," her sister would reply, "but the line is bad." Nina knew it wasn't the line. It was an operator. She began to speak in platitudes, her conversations reduced to health, weather, and grocery shortages. Then came the gray man. Pavel, on his way to the Antonov bureau, noticed him. He was a nondescript man in an ill-fitting gray coat, reading Pravda near the bus stop. He was there on Monday. He was there again on Wednesday, reading the same section. Pavel was an engineer. He recognized patterns. This man was not waiting for a bus. Pavel felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. At work, he became withdrawn. His colleagues, sensitive to changes in atmosphere, gave him a wider berth. His access to certain schematics was suddenly under administrative review, a polite way of sidelining him without an accusation. Nina experienced it at the library. Her manager, a stern party member named Galina Borisovna, called her in for a chat. She criticized Nina for the ideological tidiness of the shelves, pointing out that a volume of Dostoevsky was placed too prominently. "We must prioritize our socialist writers, Nina Dmitrievna. We must guide our readers correctly." It was a baseless criticism. Nina was meticulous. It was not a comment on her work. It was a signal that she was being watched. The most obvious and yet most mundane surveillance came from within their own building. Lyudmila Ivanovna, the Zaveduyushchi, building manager, and neighborhood block warden, suddenly became intensely interested in the Petrushenkos. She knocked on their door to check the gas pipes for the third time that month. She stopped Nina in the courtyard to ask overly specific questions about Viktor's studies, her small, bright eyes missing nothing. "He's studying so hard," she would say, her smile never reaching her eyes. "He must be learning so many interesting things about our history." Viktor, the cause of it all, felt the pressure most acutely. At the university, Dmitry Volkov now actively avoided him, crossing the quadrangle to prevent their paths from intersecting. Other students in his seminar group became quiet when he approached. He was becoming invisible, a social leper. He felt hunted. He took to walking home via roundabout routes, ducking into the metro and then emerging 2 stops later, just to see if the man in the brown hat was still behind him. He usually was. The apartment, once their sanctuary, now felt like a glass box. The walls felt thin. Pavel and Nina stopped speaking about anything of substance. They communicated in gestures and muted tones, their conversations limited to "pass the bread" or "it is time for vremya." The silence was thick with unasked questions and unspoken fears. Pavel stopped sleeping. He would sit in the kitchen in the dark, smoking his papyrusy, cigarettes, one after another, staring at the telephone on the wall. He was waiting for the call or the knock. He was an engineer. He knew that when components are placed under sufficient sustained pressure, they do not bend. They fracture. The surveillance was the pressure. The Petrushenko family was the component. And they were all, individually, beginning to break. The confrontation, when it finally arrived, was not a dramatic showdown. It was, like everything else in the system, bureaucratic and chillingly polite. Viktor was in the university library, attempting to focus on his thesis, a safe, approved topic on Soviet-Polish relations, 1945-1950, when a junior administrator tapped him on the shoulder. "Viktor Pavlovich Petrushenko, the Dean of Students requests your presence, now." The dean's office was large, dominated by a long T-shaped table and a large portrait of Leonid Brezhnev. Dean Miroshnichenko was a heavy man with a placid face, but his eyes were sharp. Seated next to him was Taras, the Komsomol secretary who had warned Viktor weeks before. Taras would not meet Viktor's gaze. "Comrade Petrushenko, please sit," the dean said, gesturing to a chair at the far end of the table, a calculated distance. "We have some concerns. Your academic work is sufficient. However, your ideological hygiene has come into question." "Ideological hygiene," Viktor repeated, his mouth dry. "It has been reported," the dean continued, looking at a file on his desk, "that you have been trafficking in anti-Soviet materials." He looked up. "Specifically, the slanderous works of the traitor Solzhenitsyn." Viktor's blood ran cold. This was worse than the conversation. The samizdat. "Furthermore," the dean went on, his voice a dispassionate drone, "it is reported that you have been consuming foreign propaganda broadcasts hostile to the USSR, and that you have been repeating these slanders to other students." Viktor looked at Taras, but the Komsomol secretary was studying his own fingernails. It wasn't Taras. It had to be Dmitri. Dmitri must have known about the books. "Comrade Dean," Viktor began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I am a loyal Soviet citizen. I am a history student. It is my job to understand all narratives." "It is your job, Comrade Petrushenko, to understand the correct narrative," Dean Miroshnichenko said, his voice hardening. "It is not your job to spread bourgeois lies that defame our system, our history, and the sacrifices of our people. It is reported you held a discussion questioning the fraternal assistance rendered to the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic in 1968. There it was. The conversation, the books, the radio, the words. Dmitri had given them everything. "This is a misunderstanding," Viktor stammered. "It was a theoretical discussion, a friend." "Your friend was concerned for you," Taras chimed in, finally looking up. His voice was laced with a rehearsed, oily sincerity. "He was concerned you were falling under a hostile influence. The university," the dean concluded, "cannot tolerate such ideological instability. The Komsomol has recommended your expulsion, and we are obliged to agree. Your studies here are terminated, effective immediately." Expulsion was a civil disaster. It meant the end of his future, a wolf ticket that would make any meaningful employment impossible. But Viktor knew, in that instant, it was not the end. It was the prelude. "Furthermore," the dean said, standing up, a signal the meeting was over, "this file and our findings will be forwarded to the relevant state security organs for their review. They may have further questions. You may go." Viktor walked out of the office in a daze. The hallway was loud with students changing classes. They seemed unreal to him, living in a world that no longer existed. He didn't go to his locker. He didn't go to the dorm. He ran. He ran all the way to the metro, his mind screaming one word: Dmitri. He burst into the apartment. Nina was home, preparing borscht. She took one look at her son's white, terrified face, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Viktor? What is it?" "They know," he panted, throwing his bag on the floor. "They know everything. The books, the radio, the conversation." "What conversation?" Nina whispered, though she already knew. "Dmitri. It was Dmitri. He was an informant. He reported everything." Viktor was pacing frantically. "I've been expelled. They said they are sending the file to the KGB." At that moment, the door opened. Pavel came home from work. He saw his wife's face, his son's panic. "What has happened?" "I've been expelled, Papa. They know about the samizdat. They know what I said about Prague." Pavel Ivanovich Petrushenko did not yell. He did not curse. His face, weary from weeks of surveillance, seemed to collapse. He walked past Viktor, took off his coat, and hung it neatly. He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked old. "So," Pavel said, his voice a dead monotone, "it is here. The thing I have feared my whole life. You brought it here, Viktor. With your truth." "Papa, Be quiet," Pavel commanded, his voice quiet but absolute. "Go to your room. Find your books. All of them. The radio. Anything. We must. But he didn't finish. He knew it was too late. The system was not sloppy. They would not have confronted Viktor at the university if they weren't already prepared to act. The confrontation was merely the last formality before the mechanism engaged its final gear. "Nina," Pavel said, his voice cracking. "They are going to come for him." Nina began to weep silently, her shoulders shaking as she stirred the pot of soup that no one would ever eat. The confrontation had not been with the dean. It was here, in their kitchen. It was the confrontation with the consequences they could no longer outrun. The knock came at 4:17 a.m. It was not the panicked, heavy banging of cinema. It was a firm, polite, and impossibly loud knock in the pre-dawn stillness of the apartment block. Knock, knock, knock. No one in the Petrushenko apartment had slept. Since Victor's return, the three of them had been sitting in the main room, the lights off, as if hiding in their own home. Pavel had chain-smoked until the air was blue. Nina had packed a small bag for Victor, a change of underwear, a bar of soap, a warm sweater, the pathetic necessities for a journey to an unknown destination. Victor just stared at the wall. Knock, knock, knock. Pavel stood up, his joints stiff. He walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Two men. They were not in uniform. They wore dark, standard-issue suits and hats, faces obscured by the dim hallway light. They were the organs. Pavel opened the door. "Pavel Ivanovich Petrushenko?" the first man asked. His voice was unremarkable, bureaucratic. "Yes. We are from the Committee for State Security. We have a few questions. May we come in?" It was not a request. The two men stepped inside, bringing the cold hallway air with them. They were polite. This politeness was the most terrifying thing of all. They glanced at Nina, who stood frozen by the kitchen doorway, and at Victor, who was half hidden in the shadows of the living room. "A small matter to clarify," the first man said, his eyes scanning the apartment, cataloging the sparse furniture, the books, the television. "Pavel Ivanovich, we need you to come with us, just for a short while, to the operational center." A wave of profound disorientation hit the family. They were here, but they weren't here for Victor. For me?" Pavel stammered. Victor stepped forward. "No, it's me you want. I am the one." The second man, who had been silent, looked at Victor with utter disinterest. "Your time will come, young man. Stay where you are. Pavel Ivanovich, please get your coat." This was the genius of the apparatus. It was a move of calculated psychological cruelty. They were not arresting the culprit. They were taking the father. They were severing the head of the family to leverage the son. Pavel, the loyal engineer, the man who believed in the system's structures, was now being consumed by them. "Where are you taking him?" Nina cried, finding her voice. "Just for a conversation, citizen," the first man said calmly. "He is a vital engineer at a sensitive facility. We are merely clarifying a security matter." It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. The security matter was the conversation Victor had in his bedroom. Pavel looked at his son. His face was a mask of sheer, unimaginable terror. He was not a dissident. He was not a hero. He was a simple, pragmatic man who had just been pulled into his son's ideological nightmare. He put on his coat. "I will be back soon," he said to Nina, his voice hollow. "No," Victor whispered, the realization dawning. "Papa, don't go with them. It's me." "Be quiet, Victor," Pavel said, his last words in his own home. "You have done enough." The two men flanked him. They did not touch him. They simply walked him out the door. The door clicked shut. Nina let out a sound, a low wail that she stifled with her hand. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. Victor stood paralyzed. He had been prepared for his own arrest. He had romanticized it even. He would be like the dissidents in the samizdat texts. He would be defiant. But this was a different, dirtier, more horrifying tactic. The state was not interested in his defiance. It was interested in his cooperation. And to get it, they had taken his father, a man whose only crime was loyalty and fear. The exposure was complete. The private conversation, which had first been exposed to an informant, then to the university, had now exposed the entire family. It had reached out and pulled Pavel Ivanovich into the unmarked black Volga that was waiting, engine running, on the dark, sleeping street below. Victor, left behind in the apartment with his weeping mother, understood that his own arrest was not the sentence. This was the sentence. The waiting, the knowing, the guilt. He was not a prisoner, but he was no longer free. The operational center was the local KGB headquarters on Volodymyrska Street, a building known to the citizens of Kiev simply as the Corner. It was a place one walked past quickly, never making eye contact with the windows. Pavel Ivanovich was not physically harmed. The methods of the Fifth Directorate in the 1970s were often more refined than the brutalism of Stalin's era. They specialized in razlodzenie, psychological decomposition. He was placed in a karcer, a small, windowless cell, for 12 hours. There was no bed, only a wooden stool. The silence was absolute. This was to soften him. After 12 hours of disorientation, he was taken to an interrogation room. It was plain, painted a sickly green, with a single bright lamp angled at the chair where he was told to sit. The investigator, Major Sidorov, was a man in his late 40s with a bland face and tired eyes. He had Pavel's file open on the desk. He offered Pavel a cigarette, which Pavel refused. "Pavel Ivanovich," Sidorov began, his voice calm, almost kind. "We have a problem, a serious one. You work at Antonov. You have a level 2 security clearance. You have access to schematics for projects of vital state importance. Correct?" "Yes, Comrade Major." "And yet, your apartment, your home, has become a nest for anti-Boolean agitation. I don't understand." Pavel lied, his voice trembling. Sidorov sighed, as if disappointed in a slow student. "Let us not waste time. Your son, Viktor Pavlovich. He reads and distributes slanderous materials. He listens to hostile foreign broadcasts. He spreads filthy lies about our fraternal assistance to Czechoslovakia." Sidorov was reading directly from a report, Dmitri's report. "He is young," Pavel whispered. "He is foolish. He doesn't mean." "His meaning is not my concern," Sidorov interrupted, his voice turning to steel. "My concern is you. You are his father. You live in the same apartment. Article 64 of the Criminal Code, treason. This includes flight abroad or refusal to return from abroad to the USSR, but it also includes conspiracy for the purpose of seizing power and divulging a state or military secret. How do we know, Pavel Ivanovich, that your son, in his foolishness, has not passed your secrets to his dissident friends? How do we know you are not compromised by his activities?" This was the trap. Pavel felt his vision narrow. They were linking Viktor's Article 70, anti-Soviet agitation, offense to Pavel's potential Article 64, treason, offense. They were threatening to ruin him not as a father, but as an engineer, a charge that carried the most severe penalties. "He knows nothing of my work," Pavel insisted. "We never discuss it, I swear." "You swear," Sidorov scoffed. "And you also swear that you were unaware of his activities? Unaware of the samizdat under his mattress? Unaware of the BBC broadcasts in your own home? This is failure to report. This is complicity, Comrade Petroshenko. You have failed in your duty as a father, and you have failed in your duty as a cleared Soviet specialist." The interrogation went on for hours. Sidorov was replaced by a younger, more aggressive questioner. They used the conveyor, one interrogator after another, asking the same questions, never letting him sleep, never letting him think. They pushed documents at him, transcripts of Viktor's conversation with Dmitri. "Did you hear him say this? It's a house of cards. Did you hear this?" "No, I was in the other room." "But you heard the radio. You permitted a hostile broadcast in your home. It was static. I didn't." "You are lying, and your lies implicate you further." After 36 hours, Pavel was broken. He was exhausted, terrified, and willing to do anything to escape the accusation of treason. He was a man who believed in structure, and his own structure was gone. "What do you want?" he finally slurred. Sidorov returned, his face neutral. "We want the truth. We want your full cooperation. We need a complete statement. About your son's activities, about his associates, about your failure to stop him. You will sign a protocol." Pavel signed. He signed a full confession, attesting to his ideological negligence as a parent and his failure to report his son's anti-Soviet behaviors. He implicated his own son to save himself from the shadow of Article 64. It was the ultimate betrayal, forced upon him by the apparatus. "Good," Sidorov said, blotting the signature. You may go home, Pavel Ivanovich. For now, you are suspended from your duties at Antonov, pending a full security review. Do not leave the city. Pavel stumbled out onto Volodymirska Street in the morning light, a free man who had just purchased his freedom at the cost of his soul. 2 days later, the same two men returned to the Petrushenko apartment. This time, they did not knock. They used a key. They were here for Victor. Victor's trial was not a trial. It was an administrative hearing, closed to the public. It lasted 45 minutes. The evidence presented was Dmitry Volkov's written testimony of the conversation, the samizdat, Solzhenitsyn, found in Victor's room, and Pavel Petrushenko's signed protocol. Victor, pale and numb, did not mount a defense. He saw his father's signature on the confession. He saw the betrayal, and in a strange, terrible way, he understood it. He was the one who had loaded the weapon. His father was just the one forced to pull the trigger. The verdict was predetermined. For violation of Article 70 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. Agitation or propaganda carried on for the purpose of subverting or weakening Soviet power, or circulating for the same purpose slanderous fabrications which defame the Soviet state and social system. The sentence was 5 years in a corrective labor colony of the strict regime, to be followed by 3 years of Silka, internal exile, forbidding him from returning to any major city in the European USSR. The family conversation, which had become a university expulsion, which had become an interrogation, had now finally become a formal, state-sanctioned sentence. The sentence was not merely for Victor. The moment the black van took him from the hearing, the social sentence for Pavel and Nina began. Pavel was not arrested again. He was far more useful to the system as a public example of failure. His security clearance at the Antonov Bureau was permanently revoked. He was formally transferred from his prestigious position as a senior aeronautical engineer. His new job, assigned by the district, was as a building superintendent, a dvornik, for a different apartment block across the city. He, who had designed components for the world's most advanced aircraft, now spent his days sweeping courtyards and unblocking toilets. The humiliation was total and precise. His former colleagues from the bureau shunned him. They would cross the street to avoid him. They knew he had been compromised, and proximity to him was contamination. He was a person of interest, and no one wanted to be also of interest. Nina was demoted at the library. She was moved from the main desk where she interacted with the public to the back room, where she spent her days repairing the bindings of damaged books with glue and tape. She worked in silence. Her manager, Galina Borisovna, never spoke to her directly, instead leaving curt notes on her workbench. Their apartment became a tomb. The neighbors, once friendly, now averted their gaze. The Zaveduyushchi, Lyudmila Ivanovna, no longer stopped by. Her curiosity was sated. The Petrushenkos were now a known quantity, the family of a political undesirable. They were pariahs. The stena, wall, of silence that surrounded them was as real as the concrete walls of their flat. Pavel and Nina rarely spoke. What was there to say? They could not discuss Victor. The apartment was still monitored, the click on the phone now a permanent fixture. But more than that, they could not look at each other without seeing the central, horrifying fact of their new reality. Pavel's protocol. Pavel had sacrificed his son to save himself from a charge of treason. Nina, in her heart, knew he had been coerced, that he was a victim of the same machine that took Victor. But the knowledge did not erase the fact. He had signed the paper. He had participated. Pavel aged a decade in a matter of months. His engineering mind, once so sharp, grew dull with the repetitive, mindless labor of his new job. He drank. He would sit in the kitchen, drinking cheap vodka, staring at his hands, the hands that used to hold calipers and blueprints, and which now held a broom. Nina found her solace in the broken books. She would meticulously repair the spines, her hands moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. She was mending what was torn, trying to hold together the pages of narratives that others had tried to destroy. It was her small, silent act of defiance. They received a single, heavily censored letter from Victor, 6 months into his sentence. It came from a colony in the Perm region, in the Urals. He wrote only of the weather, of the work, logging, and of his satisfactory health. But Nina, the librarian, read the spaces between the lines. The cramped, clumsy handwriting told her of the cold. The formal, empty phrases told her of the exhaustion. The absence of any hope told her everything. The death sentence handed down by the state was not a single final act. It was this, the slow, daily, grinding erosion of their lives. It was the death of Pavel's career, the death of Nina's social world, the death of Viktor's future, and the death of the love and trust that had once held the Petrushenko family together. The conversation was long over, but its consequences were just beginning. Years dissolved into the gray uniformity of the Zastoy. The 1970s bled into the 1980s. Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko. The faces on the televisions in the shop windows changed, but the atmosphere remained the same. Pavel Petrushenko remained a dvornik. His back was now permanently stooped. The alcohol had weathered his face, turning his skin to a sallow parchment. He was a ghost haunting the courtyard he was paid to keep clean. Nina Petrushenko remained in the library's back room. Her hair had turned completely white. She was quiet, spectral, known to the new younger librarians only as the Mender. In 1986, 8 years after Viktor's 5-year sentence should have ended, they finally received word. His 3 years of internal exile, served in a bleak, windswept town in the Krasnoyarsk region of Siberia, were complete. He was technically free. But the Propiska system, the internal passport required for residency, prevented him from returning to Kiev. He was a marked man, and no major city would have him. Then the world changed. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, rippled across the vast nation. The things Viktor had been sent to the camps for, questioning Prague, acknowledging the famine, reading Solzhenitsyn, were now being cautiously whispered in public. By 1988, they were being printed in journals. The system, in its infinite cynical flexibility, began rehabilitating its political prisoners. Viktor Pavlovich Petrushenko's case was reviewed. In 1989, his conviction under Article 70 was vacated, citing lack of a criminal element. He was finally granted a propiska for Kiev. He arrived at the central train station on a damp September morning. Pavel and Nina were waiting for him on the platform. He was 39 years old. He looked 50. The man who stepped off the train was gaunt, his skin marked by the cold and poor nutrition. His eyes were flat, emotionally hollowed out by years of forced labor and isolation. The reunion was silent. Nina wept and held him. Pavel stood back, his hands shaking, unable to bridge the gulf. "Viktor," he whispered. Viktor looked at his father. He looked at the man who had been a proud engineer and was now a broken janitor. He looked at the man whose signature had confirmed his sentence. They went back to the apartment. It was the same apartment, but it felt smaller, darker. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Pavel had been enraged by Viktor's classroom question, the same table where Pavel had sat in terror after his own interrogation. Nina prepared tea. Pavel tried to speak. "Viktor, the things I wrote, I know, Papa," Viktor said. His voice was rough, unused to conversation. "They had you. I understand the mechanism." He understood it, but he could not forgive it. He looked at his father, not with hatred, but with a vast, empty distance. Pavel had been a cog in the machine that crushed him. Viktor moved into his old room. He found a job through a new informal network of former political prisoners, working for a historical society dedicated to memorializing the very repressions he had endured. Dmitry Volkov, the man who had filed the Donos, had also fared well. He had risen steadily. He was a mid-level party functionary in the city's cultural department, a man who gave speeches about the new openness and the importance of correcting the mistakes of the past, without a trace of irony. The legacy of the conversation was a fractured, hollowed-out family. They lived together, but they were not together. Pavel was a shell, Nina was a shadow, and Viktor was a witness. The state had, in effect, succeeded. It had taken a vibrant, conflicted family unit and neutralized it, rendering all three of them harmless. This case study of the Petrushenko family is a precise illustration of the Soviet state's internal security doctrine during the era of stagnation. The system's primary antagonist was not a foreign army, but an internal infection, the uncontrolled thought, the undesirable word. The death sentence triggered by the Petrushenko's conversation was not a literal execution, but a systematic, multi-stage annihilation of a family's past, present, and future. The system did not rely on overt, theatrical brutality. It relied on a far more effective tool: complicity. The apparatus operated by transforming every citizen into a potential component of the security state. Dmitry Volkov, the informant, may not have been a malicious entity. He was likely a young, ambitious man who understood the rules of the game. To advance, one had to demonstrate loyalty. Reporting Victor was a performance of that loyalty, a sacrifice of a friend to secure his own future. He was a product of the system, not an aberration from it. The system's true genius, however, is visible in the interrogation of Pavel Ivanovich. The KGB did not need to fabricate evidence against Victor. They had ample testimony. They targeted Pavel to implicate him. By threatening him with the charge of treason, Article 64, they forced him to become an active participant in his son's destruction. They made him sign the protocol. This act achieved two critical objectives. First, it secured an unassailable conviction against Victor. Second, and far more importantly, it destroyed the family's internal trust, permanently. Pavel's guilt and shame, and Victor's cold, distant understanding were more effective jailers than any labor camp. Even after Victor's return and rehabilitation, the family unit could never reform. It was poisoned from within.